Hey, everybody, and welcome back to our study group going through Peter Adamson's A History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. Today with me, Rogerio Marquez and Graham Pong. Hey, guys.
Hey,
Hello again.
Yeah, today we'll be discussing episodes 27 to 29 of the series, and we'll be covering three dialogues, the Parmenides, Sophist, and the Cratylus. And there are three difficult dialogues, the first two especially.
yeah, to complement that, I'd say that the theory of forms falls under attack, which is particularly true for the first one, the Parmenides. But I think that it wasn't just the theory of forms that fell under attack. My ability to weed through and understand things with confidence also fell under attack. These more technical dialogues in from Plato's later works are more technical, and perhaps he was at his later phase of his career. So writing these dialogues between 361 and 347 BC, um, he was already almost after his 70s, nearing his 80s. He died at 81 years old. Maybe he was running out of patience, as Michael Segru alludes to, and so and also he wanted to put in a lot of technical um, content together, and perhaps he felt he had less time to embellish and make it more poetical. And so again, seeing here the overview of the dialogues and their thematics, we will be looking at the Parmenides, which is one of the supposed late dialogues of the Middle Dialogues, that really tackles and exposes some possible problems with the theory of the forms. That is perhaps the most quintessential theory ascribed to Plato. And then we will look at the Sophists, that both looks at the concept of what is a sophist, but under the hood also approaches language, in fact, and the theory of forms. And then we will look at the Cratylus, that is a middle dialogue also. But Peter Adamson, I think, sequences these dialogues quite nicely after each other, because we get a kind of summary of objections to the theory of the forms in the Parmenides, and then in the Sophist we get a character that is called a Eleatic stranger, or just a stranger, that shows a few arguments to put things back together again. And then in the Cratylus we go in an in-depth analysis of what gives meaning to words, and a rumination on knowledge. And well, this is my summary of what I understand from these three dialogues. If you guys want to compliment, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. So in the Parmenides, Socrates argues against Parmenides' metaphysical position that all being is one, looking at arguments for why positing that things are different lead to contradiction, and then uses a theory of forms to explain how it's not contradictory. And then Parmenides very aptly sort of points out that positing the forms leads into several problems. Um, and then in the Sophist, a conversation about the difference between philosophers and sophists. Um, I guess the way I took it, I might be wrong about this, but seems to be a bit of a patchwork to the theory of forms to be able to answer some of the objections raised in the Parmenides, and then to also give a half-decent account of what is the difference between a sophist and a philosopher. The account boiling down to sophists peddle in untruths, and their characteristic response is, well, it's impossible to even state an untruth full meaningly, because that would require to talk about non-being, and that has problems that Parmenides pointed out. So, and yeah, the Cratylus slightly disconnected from those two. Actually, Peterson points out that the Theaetetus, Parmenides, and the Sophists would make a good trilogy. Sort of three books that kind of build on top of each other. And the Cratylus is slightly separate concern, but also related. So yeah, I think that would be my kind of summary of the things. Agree with your summary of the Cratylus is just talking about where meaning of words come from.
I was going to say, my take on it is you're wrestling with Plato, the proto-set theorist, because it seems that's a lot of what he's wrestling with the forms. And again, very interesting. I think what he does is he uses his Socratic dialogue as almost rhetorical sort of thing in order to unpack his ideas. And I don't see it so much as basically it's a dog and pony show with it, considering it an attack on it. It's interesting to watch, and the more we go through this, the more I'm impressed with Plato, the writer. And then he moves on to more of what we see as the traditional philosophers, where he's a philosopher writing about philosophers philosophizing. And that's always fun to look at. And he's basically trying to tie his own ideas together. And underneath the hood, my suspicion is a lot of these are showing some of his interactions with Aristotle. And some of these are feedback of some of the discussions that they've had over things. Going to tag on that.
Yeah, I actually remarked before we went live that some of these dialogues have some aspects in them that seem to me a bit Aristotelian, and so there might have been a back and forth between Plato and the student Aristotle, and the master ended up being influenced by the student as well. So these are really interesting later dialogues.
If I'm not mistaken, in one of them, I think it's the sophist Aristotle was one of the speakers, the interlocutors.
Yeah, there's a character named Aristotle there. So, yeah. But
bright student.
We can imagine what we would like, because how Greek names go: Aristocles, Aristotles. One can also imagine Plato as an elderly sage in the grove outside his academy with his wax tablets, writing his sophist or statesman or whatnot in his during his twilight years, and or like this perhaps. I wanted to see if I could get a wax tablet, but the image generator didn't want to give me a wax tablet, which would be more appropriate. People say that the statesman that is supposedly unfinished was still only written in part in a wax tablet when Plato died, and so the process would generally be the master writes on a wax tablet, then has someone transcribe it, maybe an apprentice or a scribe or whatnot, onto papyrus for kind of backup, safekeeping, and to make more copies or whatnot. That's at least my understanding of the process and the materials like this. But if one of you guys has any other knowledge of this, please go ahead before we delve into the first dialogue.
No, I'm actually quite curious about the history of writing. Sort of collected a bunch of histories because I'm trying to pull together a history of decision making. I think history of writing. There's some highlights in the history of writing that I'd like to go over. So I recently looked at some books for the history of writing, but I haven't read them yet. So unfortunately, you're asking me this question Just a little bit too soon.
No, I was going to say, I think you're spot on with that one. That by the time you got to Plato, it was the individual, right, the master writing it down himself. Whereas before that, when you had the era of scribes, they would take the dictation and write it down. So you had one person thinking, one person writing. This combined them both into the same person at this point, and that was a result of the alphabet and innovation there. Tagging.
Yeah. Also, while Plato seemed to have his way with his stylus on a wax tablet, Aristotle, at least the texts from Aristotle that I read, in contrast, seem to mostly be lecture notes penned down by Aristotle's students, like the Nicomachean Ethics, Poetics, Rhetoric. And so it's at least my perspective that if not everything from Aristotle, most of it is lecture notes. Do you have do we either of you guys have a conception of this? If this contrast between Plato and Aristotle holds any water?
It rings a bell. Yeah. Also remember reading that most of Aristotle's most of the work that survives of Aristotle that we have are lecture notes.
Yeah, no, that sounds consistent as well. That makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so if we are ready for this, let's go to check out the problems with the theory of forms, the possible problems. So to lighten up the mood, here I show you a meme that the internet is very bountiful on philosophical memes these days, and the actual quote by Peter Adamson: "Plato's theory of forms is coming for some rough treatment." And so here we have the Parmenides, Zeno and Parmenides, who were visiting Athens, which is really unexpected, since they contested the possibility of movement and travel and whatnot. So Peter Adamson even jokes that probably they just went halfway to Athens and then just went the rest of the way. And so characteristically, these three supposedly met according to Plato, or at least according to Plato's imagined story. We are not sure whether this encounter is historically accurate or fictional. While Plato is musing, how would an aged and wise and knowledgeable Parmenides with a slightly younger Zeno, when encountering unexpectedly much younger Socrates as a young adult, what would go down with their conversation? And at the same time, Plato puts in Socrates' mouth the theory of forms, which is a really nice setup for the theory of forms to become subject to objection by these two visitors. While Socrates, being an experienced thinker, is unable to get up to gets on par with rebuttals and to contest the objectives, the objections. And so there's two possibilities to move forward here, which is we could each of us play one Zeno, the other Parmenides, and the other Socrates, or I could just read these and then you guys react at the end. How would we go? Should we do a vote like Democratic Athens or something like that? I can volunteer to be Zeno, since Zeno is already here. What do you guys say?
I'm happy to give Nodalian first pick on the last two. I don't care if I'm Socrates or Parmenides.
Well, we could go by age, and since Socrates is the youngest in this dialogue, and I'm the youngest here, we can do it that way.
Yeah, you be Socrates. You'll do good.
Yeah.
Do well as Socrates, and Graham will do well as Father Parmenides.
Exactly.
Okay,
this is sort of the Plato telling the joke, if Zeno, Parmenides, and Socrates walked into the academy, dot.
Okay, so if we are unable, or at least some of us are unable to grasp the depth of all this logic going on, at least we have managed to break the ice. And so Zeno goes yada 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 and talks about his paradoxes, the stadium paradox, the Achilles and the tortoise, his other paradoxes. He has an entire book of them. And then following this, Socrates goes,
What is the purpose of these paradoxes, Zeno?
to which, to defend my master's claim that all things are one, by showing that if they were many, then they would be riven by contradiction. For instance, they would be both similar to each other and dissimilar to each other.
This isn't particularly surprising. Of course, the things around us are similar in some respects and dissimilar in others. What would be really surprising would be if similarity itself were dissimilar, or if dissimilarity itself were similar. I cannot accept that things are one and not many, as you too would want us to believe. We should admit that things are both one and many, but we should also hold on to the idea that there are oneness itself and manyness itself. These separate absolute forms would exclude their opposites so that oneness itself can never be many, nor can manyness itself ever be one.
Well, then show us what you've got. Explain this theory of forms for us, will you?
All right, so first thing to understand is forms are immune to compressions of opposites. And one form can explain why many things share in some character, and the forms are separate from the things that partake of them. And thus forms can explain the presence of shared characteristics in the things that participate in them.
Do mundane things like hair or dirt have forms? Would each large thing have the entirety or a piece of large? Wouldn't the form of large need another form to explain its largeness? If forms are indeed immaterial, then how could a form be large?
And this is how I imagine Socrates reacting. So he basically kind of
Roll his eyes.
yeah, rolls his eyes and what the hell, man? You're you're not giving me any possibilities here. And so what I have here is the objections of Parmenides are categorized as the whole part dilemma, or the nature of participation, in which either things partake of forms in their entirety, or they only partake of part of a form. And so this brings us the dilemma that is, if the former, a form must in some way duplicate or separate itself from itself to be in many things. Thus it shatters the unity of each form. And if the latter, if the latter, we must therefore imagine numerically distinct parts of each form, and hence no longer unity. This one is the unity. So they either function a bit like a blanket over everything, or like a day over everything, or they function more like a blanket or a sail, and each thing is below a part of the form. So the forms seem to be subdivided. And then there is the third main argument, which is, wouldn't the form, example large, need another form to explain its character, example largeness? And so this creates a recursive, endless recursive pattern, which breaks the purpose of the forms. Actually, my interpretation is, since the forms are seemingly symbolic, symbols should be more wieldy than the things they symbolize. And Parmenides is kind of, with his objection, showing that the forms are even more unwieldy than in some instances, in some examples, in which we have forms being partaken by objects or things. And so the other one is, if forms are indeed immaterial, then how could the form be large? This has three parts, and it is nothing among human beings is itself by itself. And then if something is a form and it is what is in relation to something else, then that something else is a form. And the third one is, if something is among humans and is what is in relation to something else, then that other thing is also in humans. So I took notice here that things are defined by their contingency, while the forms are defined by their absoluteness, timelessness, and non-reliance. If these properties are put into question, the entire metaphysical construct holds no reliance. And so knowledge of the forms needs to go beyond the scope of human thought. And after this set of objections, Adamson listed a set of requirements. It seems almost like a set of requirements for a software project. And so they are 4 requirements that I took note. First one, each form must be one and immaterial. Second, must be independent of our minds. It must be enough unlike its participants that it is separate. And fourthly, but not unlike them, that the forms become another world unconnected to ours. So this is what I've got from the objections, and also the kind of roadmap that derives from this dialogue.
Yeah. So just to note, that last requirement, I think, is from the last objection that you maybe skipped over. It's the one that Parmenides calls the greatest difficult with the theory of the forms. He was basically talking about how sort of the like humans interact as real instantiated masters to real instantiated slaves, so they don't directly interact with the form of master or the form of slave. And this would have the forms be in a completely separate realm that's not part of this physical realm. And because nothing in the physical realms or humans can interact with these forms in any way that's spelt out, we can have no knowledge of them. And that's sort of problematic because the forms are featuring quite prominently in Plato and Socrates' theory of how knowledge is possible and what the proper objects of knowledge are. So this, so objects that the forms as stated seem like these separate metaphysical things that have nothing to do with the reality we live in, and how could we interact with them and come to know them if they're these separate things?
What do you make of all this, Graham? Is this how should we go approaching this entire set of objections and requirements?
I was going to say, this is very much this is Plato, and what he seems to be doing is pretty much this is proto-set theory, where he's arguing that the form is like the set, is the set, and then the objects of the set are the particulars. And he's wrestling with that one, and again, a lot of what they say later on, where they have form can't be part of itself, and again, you're dealing with almost Russell's paradox at that point. And what he, again, I'm jumping ahead in some of the later dialogues today, but he basically ends up equating forms with the idea of words, with the idea of thoughts, and tying everything together that way, where people think in words. A word can't be can't be inherently contradictory or refer to itself and such, and that word then is like a set in a sense that refers to particular objects in the world. This is sort of the general, my general extraction of it. And when they come into the third man problem, I'm seeing those arising, which is a very legitimate point, is how can you have a form of larger? And it usually comes apart where you have some comparison on a spectrum. And the third man doesn't exist as far as, an attribute unto itself. I think that's where Plato ends up with it, with his absolute and such. So that's sort of what I'm extracting out of this. I don't know if that makes sense to you guys, or that helps cut through some of the thorniness of Plato trying to express himself in language before what we're used to. Tagged.
Yeah, thank you for complimenting and commenting on at least my flailing attempt to weed through this. I also took note of a quote by Peter Adamson where he says, Plato is not rejecting the theory of forms, but inviting the reader to consider how it might be refined. And then the broader lesson that I try to extract from this dialogue is self-consistency is a crucial quality criterion for a metaphysical system. Nothing is more difficult than finding some non-contradictory way of characterizing reality in all its apparent variety. If anyone was asking me, so what is a difficult thing to do in philosophy? Maybe this would be one thing that comes to mind.
Yeah. So I think Plato and Socrates both were disturbed by the typical rhetorician's use of argumentation in Athens, and particularly after losing the Peloponnesian War. I think it was like more painfully aware that sort of war propaganda and wartime rhetoric, was probably quite nasty and sort of had all of the worst aspects of sophistry on full display. And that would be people making arguments that, if you don't think carefully about them, they seem convincing. They seem like sound logic, sound reasoning. So a lot of people convinced that, yeah, that sounds good. But the real masters of the arts can sort of wield them in very manipulative ways to kind of go anywhere they want. And that ability to kind of decide what you want to argue for and then reverse engineer a plausible sounding reason to get there seems quite dangerous if what you want is, if you sincerely want to arrive at the truth, sort of being aware that I don't know what the truth is, but I want to walk a path to get to the truth. And the people who are teaching the way to get to the truth are basically saying, well, I'll teach you a way you can get anywhere you want, but you won't necessarily know if it's true or not. And even some of them would contest whether there is a truth to be known at all. So I think he's sort of in that social context trying to figure out a way to reason correctly, to reason towards knowledge, towards true knowledge, and without the benefit of a theory of reasoning, a theory of inference, sort of using a literary device of dialogue as a way to work through work through various ideas about how some of the problems with sophistical rhetoric can be avoided, and try to arrive at something like a theory of correct reasoning, or a theory of reasoning towards true knowledge. And another important thing about context to have in mind is, even though Euclid only came quite later, most of the stuff I've read about Euclid is that not nearly all of the mathematical proofs that were contained in Euclid's Element were original to Euclid, although I think lots of them are considered to be original. But many results were worked out by people in the Pythagorean tradition, so there's a strong tradition of abstract mathematics. And so Plato would have had many examples of using logic and reasoning to arrive at mathematical truths, sort of having a proof a proof of concept that it's possible to arrive at proof through correct reasoning, but kind of unable to give an answer like why does it work when people do mathematics and why does it not work when people doing politics. And back in that time, no reason to suppose it shouldn't work when people are doing politics. Like these days, we kind of take it for granted that like mathematical proof skills aren't all that useful in a parliamentary setting, in a parliamentary debate, or even in a court of law. Like the lawyer's art is slightly different art than the mathematician's art, even though they both reason. But yeah, so, and I think the theory of forms, at least taken on face values, solved a bunch of difficulties that made it look very attractive. So it had properties that made it neat and simple and tidy and seemed to be able to answer a bunch of questions. But then later in his career, probably with the benefit of trying to teach the theory of forms to foreign people and to people with all kinds of different backgrounds, having had objections and being like, wait, this theory of yours doesn't quite make sense, and then putting some of the stronger objections that he ran across his theory in the mouth of Parmenides, and then maybe even later in the next one, the sophist, sort of adjusting the theory of forms a little bit so that it can, at least in appearance, answer some of those objections.
I like to think that the universe might be similar to a software program, and if we're looking at the front end of a software that has a user interface and or some nice visuals for the for whoever is experiencing the software, they are never experiencing the code directly unless they, for instance, in a website, do the inspect function. In reality, we cannot do the inspect function, even if we try as best we can through physics and science and etc. with the best devices and instrumentation we have, and even reasoning with the most refined and best methods of reasoning. At best, we will only be trying to infer what is going on with the supposed code of the universe. What kind of implementations are there? We can, for instance, infer some general laws that might apply, that might help us make predictions. But there are many concepts like goodness or beauty or equal that perhaps if the cosmos has anything to resemble software, it might be kind of implemented in the source code of the cosmos, so that it can be run in a sense when the cosmos is operating. But we can only at best try to put together a metaphysics in attempts like Plato did to try to approximate what is actually fundamentally going on with the universe. And this is kind of my attempt at broader interpretation of what was going on with Plato and these later dialogues.
No, I definitely agree, and I can bring that back to Plato, where he's dealing with the idea of words being forms, being thoughts, that sort of equivalence, and he's dealing with the map territory function, and with the inherent compression that you can go from the particulars, the particulars to the form, which is the word. And if you think of that in the map territory analogy, where you have a forest, and then on the map you just have one name for the forest and a big swath there. And that's where, I think that's where Plato was trying to, what he was trying to wrestle with at that point. And again, now it's also the whole set theory concept as well. So I don't know if that makes sense to you guys, Tag.
Yeah, I do think he's struggling with those kinds of problems, but in a way that's clearly a little confused, because he, at least in some of the earlier dialogues, kind of explicitly argued for why you could never infer the forest from a large collection of trees. So you can't go from examples of a form to knowledge of the form, because you wouldn't know they're examples of the form if you didn't know the form. So he's using the form to explain how you can know that an example is an example of each, like why something is beautiful. So you need to know that something counts as an example of beauty, you need knowledge of beauty. So to say we can find knowledge of beauty by looking at a bunch of examples and abstracting common features was for him nonsensical. And his solution to that was nonsensical as well, was to posit that no, we know the forms because we learned from experience in an infinite prior life before we were born, which logically I think the objection still holds. Like, even say at the beginning of the eternity, or just eternity back, before you had knowledge of the forms, did you learn knowledge by example or by direct knowledge? Like, how do you, if anyway, like the whole thing is a little self-contradictory
No.
and stuff. He's pointing out himself that, like, yeah, it seems a bit self-contradicting in various ways.
No, you're nailing Plato for pulling one of the old mathematician's tricks. It's when your axioms can't get yourself to where you want to reason to, you just throw in a new axiom. So it's like, you can't reason your way to an idea of beauty. Therefore, I'm going to postulate a form of beauty that you already know about. Tag.
Yeah, so new axioms that invoke infinity. Yeah, that's a whole trick. First posit infinity, and then a new axiom of a beauty, form of beauty.
Yeah. I still like to believe that, although it might be nonsense to think that our truer selves or whatnot, souls, had time to learn or somehow had this kind of knowledge from scratch, that even though that might be nonsense, we are still a part of the cosmos, and the cosmos is within us inextricably. And so by reasoning as best we can, we are literally the cosmos running itself to figure itself. So we are not a kind of an external observer or completely of what is going on, for ill and for good, because we are interfering as we are trying to study what is. And this kind of way that Plato deals with examples in the earlier dialogues, as he kind of flees from the dialogues like a devil from the cross, and then in the Sophist he puts their protagonist, that we can show the Sophist, if you guys are okay with going with the Sophist. So Sophist: Socrates asks a follower of Parmenides and Zeno, which is called the Eleatic stranger, whether in his Elia the Sophist, state person, and philosopher are considered conflated or distinct, and then goes on to define a Sophist. And not just this, they also address the theory of forms and what does it mean, and how does it go head on with Parmenides' idea of being and oneness, of his monism. And so it's really odd to see two things here in this dialogue. Firstly, Socrates stops being a main character. He's there, but he's kind of goes to a secondary role. And then the main character, this Eleatic visitor or Eleatic stranger, has quite different ways of tackling epistemology and reasoning than Socrates. He kind of doesn't shirk away from doing long speeches, and while he does as well consider doing dialectic, he wants to do dialectic with someone that won't bring him much trouble. And so Theaetetus is a really nice kind of cannon fodder for him. And so they go on succinctly talking about how they could distinguish a sophist from these other two categories, philosopher and statesman, and in the process, as I mentioned, end up talking about the process of collection and division, which kind of shows that examples can be worthwhile, and it kind of harkens to the processes that we use today to train AI. We just feed the AI a really big bunch of data, and then the AI hopefully approximates the form of the training data, meaning like images of a cat or whatnot, just to give an example. And then the AI or the Eleatic stranger, having a bunch of examples, can separate the sophist from the other two guys by virtue of having all these gathered data or examples. And this process of division, as Adamson talked about, it is kind of arbitrary in the sense that we can go about dividing a whole bunch of heterogeneous things by focusing on firstly on one attribute, or focusing firstly on another attribute and then choosing a different secondary attribute and further separating the already separated groups further. And so we might end up with completely or substantially different outcomes just by the choices that we do when we are engaging in the division. And then I also thought it was really interesting that Adamson talks about the example given in the Phaedrus, that a bad butcher would cut haphazardly, but a good butcher would cut along the natural joints of whatever class they are considering. So kind of giving a hint at a best practice set of guidelines to do the division. And so this is my gist of the sophist.
Yeah, it would have been nice for me if Peterson would just actually spell out what the definition of the sophist was then. Be a little easier to understand the flow of argument that happened if he did that. All he says is they're now able to offer a final analysis of the sophist in terms of his production of false images or copies, his imitation of wisdom. And so the Eleatics would say like this false images are impossible because they would involve non-being. And so there's this whole theory of how no, you can get that by the form of being, and I think the forms of difference and similarity. You can also answer some other questions about change, and same by the form of change and the form of rest. So he introduces these 5 greatest kinds: the form of being, the form of change, the form of rest, the form of similarity, and the form of dissimilarity. So using those forms, kind of answering the Eleatic objection that it's nonsense to talk about non-being. You could just say, well, no, the sophists, when we say they're producing false images, we're saying they're producing beings that's different from the things that beings are pointed to, something like that. So they're producing different beings that are presented as if they're the same, I guess. And so what does Peterson say about what he's done? I said, given the uncharacteristic note of total success struck at the end of the dialogue, you get the sense that Plato is rather pleased with himself. And why shouldn't he be? He's exhibited a cunning method for tracking down conceptual quarry and managed to catch the most elusive of prey, the sophists. He's finally laid to rest the formidable problem of non-being, which tripped up even Parmenides, whom he seems to regard as his most outstanding predecessor. And in the process, he's revamped the theory of forms and given the first ever account of what makes language true and false. Not bad for a dialogue's work.
Yeah, so basically you answered this question that I had here, more or less. I also like the image of the giants versus gods. While the giants are more attached to their senses, the gods are more like idealist philosophers. So gods more empirical, and giants more empirical, and gods more idealists. And yeah, go ahead, Graham.
No, I was going to sit there and say my idea that I got out of this for the definition of sophist is sort of their technique of arguing where they're basically looking at properties. And they're using, from, I guess, Plato's standpoint of the forms, it's like fishness. Well, a fisherman has fishness because he fishes and works in that one, and a fish is fishness. Therefore, a fish and fisherman are the same thing because they partake in the same form. And that's the sort of technique that I think Plato is calling out here. And to me, it's trying to escape the being, becoming, merging that Heraclitus always emphasized. And it's what Parmenides, when we were talking about him, when they tossed out his idea of monad, it's the idea of we can only talk about what is. We can't talk about what it was, what is becoming, or basically how it becomes. And that's very much a limitation of the idea of words and language, because they were equating words with static things. And I'm not sure that, I think Plato's making a categorical error of trying to say you can have a form of change. That just, I see his forms being thoughts, and it's one of those that's a problematic one there. It's almost referring to itself or something. Just that's sort of my extraction here. Tagging.
Yeah. I think Plato's attempt to solve these things are highly problematic in a bunch of ways. But the sophists or Parmenides could very well complain that by positing the existence of a form of difference, was sort of assuming something is not true, and that Parmenides has already shown to not be true by various arguments that if you assume differences exist, you run into contradictions, and he shows the contradictions, many contradictions. And I think in the Parmenides, they've only really debunked one of the contradictions. So there are many, so they haven't really exhausted the contradictions that the Eleatics show follow if you assume the existence of the form of difference. Plato just kind of, let's assume the existence of the form of difference, and then we can refute Parmenides that way. Sure, if you assume stuff, you can refute anything you want. Let's assume you're wrong, and then I will show you that you're wrong by my assumption that you're wrong.
If I were the guy defending the theory of forms, I would try to play on the safe side and only posit forms that have positive characteristics, and stay completely away from forms that are kind of like the negative of equality, like difference. And when things are different, I would just try to defend that they are not partaking in the form of equality, to simplify things. Because if the forms are supposed to help us with knowledge, in a sense, if they are being more unwieldy than the real world or whatnot, then they are being a hindrance to knowledge instead of facilitating knowledge and communication.
Yeah. As far as I can tell, nobody's ever really gotten any closer to understanding of beauty or justice by taking Plato's forms very seriously. The theory of forms itself not super helpful in understanding justice or beauty, as far as I'm aware. Maybe I'm just ignorant. But yeah, trying a noble thing and getting very interesting results, putting it in a rich literary form is interesting to learn about and interesting for historical reasons. But yeah, not a fan of the theory of forms.
Yeah, I was going to say I give Plato just credit for he did the first attempt. So it's somebody's got to do the first attempt for other people to correct. Even if we can't shoot it full of holes at this point. And again, a lot of it is I go with he's wrestling with a much more limited vocabulary than what we have today, and that lets me cut him some slack as well. Gonna tag.
Speaking of vocabulary, that nicely leads us to the next dialogue. Are you guys up for it?
Sure.
So the Cratylus, or in a nutshell, Socrates, Hermogenes, and Cratylus discuss the correctness of names. Or we could say, how do words have meaning? Should words have a meaning, or should we assume that words only have meaning when the words themselves are kind of like a good representation of the qualities of the thing being represented? In other words, we only name dogs by saying bark or off, woof, or whatever. And such things. So kind of like a naturalistic kind of naming process, while the other camp argues that that is ludicrous or nonsense. And even though there might be words that kind of hint at the properties of the things being named, words overwhelmingly are quite different from what is being represented. A bit like when Peter Adamson mentioned that a piece of clothing that in nothing resembles a friend might remind us of a friend, in contrast to a painting of the friend that is much more resembling the friend. And so it seems to me, my interpretation is that the overwhelming process of creating vocabulary is by convention, and this hints at as well at the importance of foundational and very disseminated texts in a culture, like the Homeric and Hesiodic texts in ancient Greece, or the Bible in the Middle Ages, or the Ramayana and Mahabharata in India, or the Epic of Gilgamesh in Sumeria. And nowadays, who knows what's holding us together. And so, yeah, this is more or less my take on this, and I'm eager to know what you guys think about it.
Yeah, so I think the mentioning the dialogues about how words get meanings is good, and there are two broad doctrines considered, that words get their meanings by convention and agreement, and the other doctrine is that no, words get their meaning in some natural kind of way. That goes back to things like onomatopoeia, where words sound a little bit like the things they're at. So splash, the noises that come out of my mouth sounds a little bit like water splashing, so reminds it in that way. But then also, those would be sort of some of the basic words, but then there are etymologies would put together basic words to arrive at quite natural words for things that kind of make sense. So I guess in English, an example would be a waterfall. If you like, quite a natural seems a natural choice for words to describe water falling over a cliff, or some kind of cliff. And yeah, I think the position in this case Socrates takes is some middle ground between like purely convention, like completely arbitrary noises that people just assign meaning for, and this natural thing where there are some basic things that some basic words that are built up from things like onomatopoeia that are natural for that reason, and then the basic words get put together in etymologies that make sense. But there are like various, even in Greek, words in which it's kind of impossible to even dream up, even with a bit of creativity, dream up a reasonable etymology or a reasonable onomatopoeia. And so there are, I think he takes more or less a position. Some words have these natural meanings, and some words over time have been corrupted. I think even one of the things he says in the dialogues is there used to be like a pure godlike Greek that the gods invented, and over time people have sort of shortened words to make them easier to say, or added syllables to words to make them easier to say, or just kind of mispronounced words, and like over time it's gotten degenerate. So there are examples of conventional words that the gods would have different words for the same things, but the Greeks have their words for. So an interesting talk. They don't mention it because I think how would they? But it reminds me of I think it's Lakoff, which is a philosopher or a cognitive psychologist of some kind, who wrote a book, Metaphors We Live By, and sort of looked at how deeply metaphorical a lot of language is, and specifically how a lot of those metaphors have like are metaphors that refer to bodily movements. I guess he's a big name in embodied cognition, where people say like we think with our bodies also, not just our brains, and sort of pointing out to our language use as like a lot of words have references to the ways you might move your body. And I'm going to struggle to think of lots of examples now, but it's kind of besides the point. It's just an interesting music.
If I may try to attempt one, like the word fire. The word fire starts with which is something I see the guy from Primitive Technology on YouTube. Shout out to that guy, because he does amazing videos with starting from scratch, building stuff. And he shows many videos how to make fire, and he does that. He blows on the fire necessarily when it starts to stoke it, to get it bigger. And so this one came from the top of my head.
Yeah, so I think that's an example Socrates would have liked. Some of the other kinds of examples that I was thinking about, I think project has an etymology that goes back to throwing forwards. So like we have projects that we're planning ahead for, and subject is I think throwing underneath. Object is throwing against. Understanding is an interesting way, like just to stand underneath a thing and sort of be able to see it's the guts of the thing. Yeah, there are a bunch of examples. I'm not going to be able to remember too many of them now. Graham, any comments?
Yeah, no, I was going to say, in here I see a lot of Plato proto-semiotics going on, where he's talking about the signifier and the signified, and that being the concept of words, and that goes back to again, one of my favorite philosophers, Charles Sanders Peirce from the late 1800s, where he'd helped found semiotics. And some of what they're talking about here is like I always call definitional debates, where people can be using the same word for different objects or different meanings, or have the same meaning and have different words for that same meaning and be arguing because of that. And that's where the emphasis of the one text that kind of binds the society together that Rogerio was talking about comes in. And for the longest time in the Western world, that was like Shakespeare, Shakespeare's plays and such. And nowadays, I think what we have is, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Marvel, DC Comics. Those are pretty much what we've gone to these days, and that seems to be what's filling that role into the modern world today. I'm going to tag on that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Graham. I wasn't able to find any, striking examples, but given the popularity of the Endgame and Infinity War films, that drastically contrasts with the inception of comic book movies. In the 80s, everyone ignored, mostly ignored comic book movies. but they become blessed with some excellence in the storytelling and technical excellence as well. And it seems to parallel the excellence in execution in these myths, more ancient myths that I mentioned, that they might have become popular not just by having virtuous lessons in them, but by maybe even more so by being excellently and engaging stories that become very popular among a population, which basically makes them kind of cultural bedrock in the population. Yeah, and also another thing that I would like to mention is when only recently I've studied the Christian and the Judaic texts more seriously, with the help of Isaac Asimov, who did a guide to the Bible. And I know it might not be perfect. He's not a perfect scholar of the Bible, but he, to my amazement, revealed to me that we have many words in our English and Portuguese and whatnot languages, contemporary languages, that are filled with words that we don't know, but they are of Hebrew origin and also Aramaic origin. Latin we already kind of know, and Greek we just need to listen to Peter Adams and going on. But words like divine, Satan, um, uh, hell, they come from Hebrew, and I was amazed to know to know that. I had no idea, and so our contemporary languages are a jumble of words from Old English, of course, to be sure, but some French, some which comes from Latin, of course, Greek, words from Hebrew, and other foreign words that have been inserted, just to give the example of contemporary English.
No, definitely. I always refer to English as basically the amoeba of languages. It doesn't meet words it's not willing to absorb and take for itself. Tagging.
Yeah, it's a bit like that. Just a thought. I think the French language had the Celtic culture had a large impact on French too. So not just Latin. So it's a very odd kind of Latin to sort of Italian ears, or even Spanish ears, the French kind of version, because I think the Franks were influenced by the Celts, and also there's some Germanic influences that went into there as well. But yeah, I think most languages, most large languages, the nations that spread over a geographic region will have had many different cultures who speak different tongues over different times, and sort of national languages kind of mix in different aspects of that. My native language is Afrikaans, and that's kind of a mix of Dutch and a bunch of native languages from South Africa. So it's a Dutch that changed because it moved to a different part of the world and was in contact with different languages. I think languages change like that quite normally and frequently. I think of all the people, the French are the most jealous and try to guard
Protectionist.
protectionist of the language. Yeah, they have an academy of French language or something, and whose job it is to write dictionaries of what is French and is not French, and anything not in that dictionary, technically, according to the French, is not French. Very conservative. Well, what they include, of course, like slang French includes all kinds of things. It just evolves the same way natural languages evolve. But yeah.
I would also like to give another example of how convention of words might change over time, which is, it seems to me that people, of course, are lazy. People are lazy. And to give an example from Portuguese, in the Middle Ages, people would say Your Grace by saying Vossa Graça. and then it degenerated to vos me sé. And then nowadays people say more formally in formal conversations to address another person, they will just say você. So it went from vossa graça to vos me sé, and then to você. And this is clearly, to my mind, the people's kind of expediency and maybe even laziness at work here.
Or the accumulated disrespect of youth towards their elders. One of the two.
yeah. Perhaps there's, of course, this interchange between youth and their elders, while the youth are generating slang that is kind of generated like with a spirit of stick it to the man, and we won't talk like the squares. We will talk like we will be cool about our mode of speech. And then some of these words that are, people sometimes graduate from them and start to speak like an adult. Some of these words pass like as if through osmosis to the adult world. And when during my time, people would say slang expressions like fish in Portuguese, which means cool. Nowadays, you can see many adults saying these words. So people kind of aged with these words while they were kids and teens, and now as adults they continue to use the words quite casually.
Oh, absolutely. You're showing exactly why the Athens was right to kill Socrates back in the day. He was doing all of that to the kids. Tag.
Yeah. Damn corrupt kids. Has to be someone's fault for their corruption. Yeah, I was gonna say, like, we could use any words we want, but I think it would be classified as how the squares talk, because we partake in the form of the squares.
There's also a very good resource on language on YouTube that I recommend. It's a guy called Native Lang. He did and continues to do videos on many languages, even ancient languages that are no longer extant. He even tries to investigate how they would sound like, and the etymology and the reasoning behind why words sound like they do, or how they put together the letters and whatnot. And one of the examples that stuck with me was the example of Korean, in which the words in Korean, when written down in their symbols, in their symbolical form, the symbols are consistently a reference to how the human vocal apparatus is moving during speech. And so it's a remarkable example of a language in which the written form is very consistent with the speech physiological process, while many other words in other languages have other reasoning behind them in terms of how they ended up as words.
No, I agree. The evolution of alphabets and what written language is it's a fascinating subject, and how that the different ways encode different minds. That's one of the ones where it's like Greek's so interesting because it's using a Semitic alphabet in order to encode an Indo-European language, which is an interesting mix.
Yeah.
Just observation tagging.
Yeah, the alphabet, after all, was an invention attributed to the Phoenicians, right?
Right. Yeah. No, they developed it, and it was part of their, more of a universal trade language. So it was easier to communicate, amongst themselves in different areas, and with the local people once they taught it to them.
Yeah, this reminded me of a really interesting thing about language when it was starting to be written down in ancient Greece. When I briefly studied Hesiod, just for curiosity, turns out that before written language, poets would do kind of what we would interpret today as rap battles, while instead of trying to insult each other like rap battles go nowadays, they would try to praise gods as best as they can with these epithets that each poet would know, and they would say a stream of adjectives and whatnot associated with a god, and then kind of praise them in terms of their achievements and etc. And these would be competitions that would receive prizes and whatnot between the poets, and possibly the some of the poems that became written down were considered the kind of best hits of what was improv poetry at the time.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Well, and in terms of this session, I'm all spent, and if you guys want to add anything, go ahead. But I have said everything I could about language and the other dialogues.
No, I was going to say these are interesting ones, and it's very nice to do these streams with you guys, so I can go back and revisit some of these with fresher eyes, because I looked at it when I was in my 20s, and I've learned a lot since then, and it's kind of neat to see it from a different perspective this time. Again, I'm amazed at what a good writer Plato was.
Yeah,
Tag
I
in.
agree.
Yeah, I learned some things about Plato's later theory of the forms that I never knew. Like, so the five greatest kinds was something new to me, and also was unaware of how much Plato criticized his own theory of forms with some kind of the obvious problems with them. Yeah, so quite more impressed with Plato than I was before these episodes.
Yeah,
And you guys
I
also
shared
appreciate it.
I share that feeling as well. I thought he was just a guy that wrote Socrates in, and turns out he was developing quite refined thoughts that are foundational and will help us explain what went afterwards, after Plato, like with Aristotle and whatnot. I have just a final slide to kind of tease what's going to happen in the next session. We will still be discussing Plato, and we will see Plato's take on science. To be frank, probably a reluctant take on science at the end of his career, after trying to stay away from natural philosophy as best he can. But probably people were kind of pitching in to request him to write something on it, and he did. And then we will look at two so-called erotic dialogues that talk about attraction and love, according to the Greek conception of love and attraction. And that's pretty much it.
Cool. Yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks, guys, and thanks to everyone watching. See you next time.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye.